There are moments in a person's life when grief and music collide with such force that what comes out the other side is no longer just sound but something closer to prayer, and for Jimi Hendrix, that moment came on a cold February morning in 1958 when he was 15 years old, standing outside Swedish Hospital in Seattle, holding a cheap acoustic guitar with 3 broken strings and trying to find the courage to walk through those doors. Inside, his mother Lucille was dying, her liver destroyed by years of alcohol, her body shutting down room by room like a house going dark, and Jimi had promised her, weeks earlier when she could still speak clearly, that he would play for her one more time before the end. He had no idea that the song he would play, a stumbling improvised melody that barely held together, would haunt him for the remaining 12 years of his life, or that the guitar he played it on would eventually meet its end in flames on a stage thousands of miles away, burned not in spectacle but in ritual, an offering to a ghost he could never fully lay to rest. What happened in that hospital room was witnessed by only 3 people, Jimi, his father Al, and a nurse named Dorothy Green who decades later would tell a local Seattle newspaper that she had heard thousands of patients receive visitors, but she had never heard anything like the sound that came from that boy's guitar, a sound so raw and broken it made her step outside the room and cry in the hallway. The guitar itself, a battered harmony acoustic that Jimi had saved for months to buy from a pawn shop on Jackson Street, would survive only 5 more years before Jimi destroyed it in 1963, not during a concert or a moment of rock and roll excess, but alone in a basement in New York City, methodically smashing it against a concrete wall and then setting the pieces on fire in a metal trash can while tears streamed down his face. And the reason he destroyed it, the secret he carried until the night before his own death when he finally told his girlfriend Monica Danman, reveals something about Jimi Hendrix that the mythology of the guitar god could never contain. He was a boy who loved his mother desperately, blamed himself for not saving her, and spent the rest of his life trying to play his way back to that hospital room to get it right. To understand why that guitar had to burn, we need to understand Lucille Hendrix, a woman who history remembers mostly as a footnote in her son's biography, the troubled mother who drank too much and died too young, but who was so much more complex and tragic than that simple narrative allows. Lucille was beautiful, everyone who knew her agreed on that, with high cheekbones and expressive eyes that could shift from laughter to sadness in seconds. She had grown up poor in Seattle during the Depression, had married Al Hendrix when she was barely 18, and had given birth to Jimi in 1942 during a time when the world was at war and stability was a luxury no one in their community could afford. But Lucille struggled with demons that had names no one spoke out loud in the 1940s and 50s. Today we might recognize her symptoms as depression, anxiety, possible bipolar disorder, conditions that with treatment and support might have been manageable, but in post-war Seattle in a black neighborhood where mental health resources were non-existent and asking for help was seen as weakness, Lucille self-medicated the only way she knew how, with alcohol. She would disappear for days, then return full of apologies and promises, shower Jimi with affection and attention, then drift away again into a fog of vodka and despair. Al worked long hours and had little patience for what he saw as Lucille's failure to hold herself together, and the marriage became a cycle of arguments, separations, brief reconciliations, and deeper fractures. Jimi learned early to read his mother's moods, to sense when she was sliding into darkness, to try to pull her back with his presence, his jokes, his desperate need for her to stay. When he was 7 years old, he started stealing empty bottles from the house and hiding them in the yard, thinking that if he could just get rid of the bottles, maybe his mother would stop drinking, not understanding that the bottles were symptoms not causes. When he was 9, he started following her when she left the house at night, trailing her at a distance through dark Seattle streets, terrified she wouldn't come back, too afraid to call out to her, just watching to make sure she was safe. She caught him once, turned around and saw him standing under a streetlight half a block behind her, and instead of being angry she walked back, knelt down, and held him while he cried, and she whispered, "Baby, you can't save me. I wish you could, but you can't." But Jimi didn't believe that. He was 9 years old and he believed love could fix anything, believed that if he was just good enough, quiet enough, helpful enough, his mother would choose to stay. He started bringing her things, flowers he picked from neighbors' yards, drawings he made at school, pennies he found on the sidewalk, tiny offerings laid at the altar of her attention. And sometimes it worked, sometimes she would light up, pull him close, tell him he was her special boy, her gift, the best thing she had ever made. Those moments were enough to keep him trying, enough to make him believe that the next offering might be the one that made her whole. When Jimmy got his first guitar at age 15, a beat-up acoustic that Al bought from a customer who couldn't pay for car repairs, music became his most powerful offering. He would sit in the small room he shared with his younger brother Leon and practice for hours, teaching himself chords from a book he had shoplifted from a downtown music store, his fingers bleeding from the steel strings but refusing to stop because he had discovered something. When he played, really played, his mother would pause whatever she was doing and listen. She wouldn't say anything, wouldn't come into the room, but he could feel her attention through the thin walls, and for those few minutes while the music lasted, she was present, fully there, not drifting toward the next drink. He started playing for her deliberately, choosing songs he thought she might like, slow blues melodies that ached with longing, and he would watch through the crack in the door as she sat on the couch, her eyes closed, tears sometimes sliding down her cheeks, and he thought, this is it. This is how I save her. If I can just get good enough, if I can make the music beautiful enough, she'll want to stay for it. But addiction doesn't work that way, doesn't respond to love or talent or desperate 15-year-old boys playing guitar with bleeding fingers. Lucille's health deteriorated rapidly in late 1957. Her skin took on a yellowish tint, her hands shook constantly, and she lost weight until her clothes hung on her like she was a child playing dress-up. Al tried to get her to see a doctor, but she refused, afraid of what they would say, afraid of hospitals, afraid of everything except the bottle that was killing her. And then one night in January 1958, she collapsed in the kitchen, and when the ambulance came and took her to Swedish hospital, the doctors told Al that her liver was failing, that she had weeks at most, and that there was nothing they could do except try to keep her comfortable. Jimmy visited her every day after school, taking 2 buses to get to the hospital, sitting beside her bed while she drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she knew who he was, would reach for his hand and say his name, and sometimes she looked at him like he was a stranger, confused about where she was or what year it was. The nurse, Dorothy, told Jimmy that hearing was often the last sense to go, that even when his mother seemed unconscious she might still be able to hear him, and she suggested he talk to her, tell her things, let her know she wasn't alone. But Jimmy couldn't find words. Everything he wanted to say felt too big or too small, too angry or too loving, and the sentences would jam in his throat and refuse to come out. So instead, one morning in early February, he brought his guitar. He had to sneak it past the front desk because instruments weren't allowed in patient rooms, but Dorothy saw him and looked the other way, understanding somehow that this was important, that this boy needed to say goodbye in the only language that made sense to him. Al was already in the room when Jimmy arrived, sitting in the chair by the window, staring out at the rain. He looked up when Jimmy entered with the guitar and for a moment it seemed like he might object, might say this wasn't the time or place, but then he just nodded and turned back to the window. Lucille was unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular, her face so pale she barely looked real. Jimmy sat in the chair on the other side of the bed, positioned the guitar on his lap, and realized he had no idea what to play. He started with St. Louis Blues, one of the songs he knew she liked, but his fingers fumbled the chords and it sounded wrong, tinny and desperate in the sterile hospital air. He stopped, tried Somewhere Over the Rainbow, but that fell apart too, his voice cracking on the second line. He could feel panic rising in his chest, the sense that he was failing her again, that even now, at the very end, he couldn't give her what she needed. His hands were shaking, the guitar felt foreign and uncooperative, and he thought about putting it down, apologizing, leaving. But then something shifted. He stopped trying to play songs he knew and just let his fingers move, following instinct rather than memory, and what came out was something new, something that had never existed before and would never exist again. It wasn't a melody exactly, more like a conversation, his fingers asking questions and answering them, moving through grief and love and anger and regret, saying everything he couldn't say with words. The notes were simple, almost childlike, built around 3 chords that repeated and evolved, and he played it quietly, barely above a whisper, leaning close to his mother's ear so she could hear. And as he played, something happened. Lucille's breathing changed, became more regular, deeper. Her eyes moved under her closed lids. Her hand, which had been lying still on the white hospital blanket, twitched slightly, as if reaching toward the sound. Dorothy, who was checking vitals in the next room, stopped what she was doing and stood in the doorway, watching. Al turned from the window, his face unreadable, but his eyes were wet. Jimmy played for 20 minutes, maybe longer, losing track of time, existing only in the space between his fingers and the strings, between the sound and his mother's breathing. And then, so quietly he almost didn't notice, Lucille's lips moved. No sound came out, but Jimmy could read the shape, "Thank you, baby." And then her breathing slowed, became peaceful, and she slipped into a deeper unconsciousness that she would never wake from. She died 3 days later, on February 2, 1958, with Al beside her but without Jimmy, who couldn't bring himself to be there at the actual moment, afraid that his presence might somehow make it hurt more. The funeral was small, held at a church Lucille had never attended but that Al thought looked respectable, and Jimmy sat in the front pew in a borrowed suit that didn't fit right, staring at the closed casket and feeling nothing, a numbness so complete it frightened him. People talked to him afterward, offered condolences, said she was in a better place now, and he nodded and said thank you and felt like he was watching everything from very far away. The only thing that felt real was the guitar, which he carried with him everywhere now, sleeping with it beside his bed, taking it to school, holding it even when he wasn't playing, like a talisman against grief. But the guitar had changed. Every time he looked at it, he saw that hospital room, smelled the antiseptic and the death, heard his mother's labored breathing. Every time he played it, the strings felt wrong, the sound felt wrong, like the instrument itself had been infected by loss and could never produce pure music again. He tried to play other things, tried to reclaim it, but everything that came out sounded like that last song, that broken improvised goodbye, and he couldn't escape it. In the months after Lucille's death, Jimmy threw himself into music with an intensity that worried the few people who cared enough to notice. He joined his first band, the Velvet Ones, playing local teen dances and church basements, and he practiced until his fingers bled, then kept practicing, as if volume and speed could drown out the silence his mother had left behind. He discovered that on stage, under lights, with amplification and an audience, he could disappear into the music so completely that he forgot to hurt, and that feeling, that blessed temporary erasure, became addictive. But he never played that hospital song again. He tried once, alone in his room late at night, and got through maybe 4 bars before he had to stop, the grief so overwhelming he thought he might physically break. So he buried it, locked it away in some back corner of his musical memory, and told himself it was better forgotten, that looking forward was the only way to survive. The guitar itself lasted another 5 years. Jimmy took it with him when he enlisted in the Army in 1961, played it in barracks and on weekend passes, carried it through his discharge and his early years playing backup on the Chitlin circuit. It survived rough handling and travel and the casual carelessness of youth, but it didn't survive New York City in 1963, the night Jimmy came back to his tiny apartment after a particularly brutal gig where the headliner, a singer whose name history has forgotten, had berated him for playing too fancy and threatened to fire him if he didn't stay in his lane. Jimmy was exhausted, broke, hungry, and something in him just snapped. He looked around that basement apartment with its water-stained ceiling and its single hot plate and its mattress on the floor, and he looked at the guitar, that battered harmony that had been with him through everything, and suddenly he hated it. Hated it for not being good enough, for not having saved his mother, for being a witness to his failure. He picked it up and smashed it against the wall, once, twice, 3 times, until the neck cracked and the body splintered and strings sprung loose like broken veins. But destroying it wasn't enough. He needed it gone, completely gone, needed to erase every physical reminder of that hospital room and that last song and the unbearable weight of loving someone you couldn't save. So he gathered the pieces, put them in a metal trash can in the back alley, doused them in lighter fluid from someone's discarded barbecue kit, and set them on fire. And as he watched the wood blacken and curl and turn to ash, he cried for the first time since his mother's funeral, cried with a grief so pure and complete it left him hollow. A neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson who had always been kind to him, came out and found him there, sitting on the ground watching the flames, and she didn't ask what he was burning or why. She just sat down beside him and put her hand on his shoulder and stayed until the fire burned out. Years later, when Jimi was famous, Mrs. Patterson would tell a reporter that she had known, somehow, that the boy burning something in that alley would either destroy himself completely or become something extraordinary, and it was too close to call which way it would go. After that night, Jimi never spoke about the guitar or what it represented. He moved forward, got better instruments, developed his style, eventually made it to London and became the Jimi Hendrix the world would remember. But people close to him noticed patterns that connected back to that loss in ways he probably didn't even recognize. His relationship with guitars became almost ritualistic, sacred in some moments and violently destructive in others. He would spend hours caring for an instrument, adjusting the action, cleaning every surface, and then turn around and smash it on stage or set it on fire, the destruction performed with the same reverence as the maintenance. And when he set his Stratocaster on fire at Monterey in 1967, the act that would become his defining image, people assumed it was showmanship, rock and roll theater, but those who knew him best saw something different. They saw a man performing a ritual he had first enacted in a New York alley, an offering made to a ghost, a symbolic destruction of the thing he loved because he had learned at 15 that love and loss were inseparable and that sometimes the only way to honor something was to let it burn. His girlfriend at the time, Kathy Etchingham, later recalled that after Monterey, Jimi came back to their hotel room and was quiet for hours, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands. She asked if he was okay, and he said, "I did it for my mother. I don't know if that makes sense, but I needed her to see that I became something. That her son became something." Kathy didn't understand, because Jimi had never told her about Lucille, about the hospital, about the guitar he had burned years before, but she held him anyway, and he fell asleep with his head in her lap, and she stayed awake listening to him murmur in his sleep, words she couldn't quite make out but that sounded like apologies. The truth about that hospital song, the improvised melody Jimi played for his dying mother, only came fully to light on September 17, 1970, the night before Jimi died. He was in London, staying at the Samarkand Hotel with Monica Danman, and he was in a reflective mood, talking about his childhood, about Seattle, about things he rarely discussed. Monica later testified that he told her about Lucille, about the hospital, about playing guitar while his mother died, and he said, "I've been trying to play that song again my whole life. Every solo, every note, I'm trying to get back to that feeling, that purity, but I can't find it. I think I left it in that room with her." He told Monica about burning the guitar, about how he had needed to destroy it because every time he touched it he felt 15 again, helpless and failing, and how he had thought that burning it would free him, but it hadn't, it had just made the ghost more permanent, written it into his muscle memory every time he set another guitar on fire. "I keep burning them," he said, "because I'm trying to send them to her, wherever she is. Like maybe if I destroy enough beautiful things, one of them will find its way to her and she'll know I'm sorry. Sorry I couldn't save her. Sorry I wasn't enough." Monica tried to tell him that he had been a child, that addiction was a disease, that he couldn't have saved his mother, but Jimi just shook his head. "That's what everyone says," he replied. "But knowing it and feeling it are different things. I still feel like I should have been able to do something. Play better, be enough to make her want to stay." And then he picked up his guitar, the black Stratocaster he had been playing that tour, and he played something soft and slow, just for Monica, and she said it was the saddest thing she had ever heard, sadder than any blues, and when he finished his eyes were wet and he said, "That's as close as I can get. That's the ghost of the song I played for her." Less than 24 hours later, Jimi Hendrix was dead, found unresponsive in that same hotel room, his death ruled as asphyxiation from vomit after mixing wine and sleeping pills. The official story called it an accident, possibly suicide, the tragic end of a rock star who burned too bright. But those who knew about Lucille, about the hospital, about the guitar he had played and then destroyed, saw something else, a man who had been carrying grief for 12 years, trying to transmute it into music, never quite succeeding, never quite forgiving himself for failing to save the person he loved most. In the years since Jimi's death, the mythology has focused on the spectacle, the burned guitars, the wild performances, the innovations that changed rock music forever. But the quieter truth, the one that explains so much about why he played the way he played and destroyed the things he created, lies in a Seattle hospital room in 1958, where a 15-year-old boy played a song for his dying mother that he would spend the rest of his life trying to replay and could never quite recapture. There is no recording of that hospital song. No one wrote down the chords or the melody. It existed for 20 minutes in a room filled with grief and love and impossible goodbyes, and then it disappeared, living on only in Jimi's memory and in the way it shaped everything he played afterward. Every note he ever recorded, every solo that made audiences weep or scream or sit in stunned silence, carried in it some echo of that first improvised offering, the sound of a boy trying to tell his mother he loved her in the only language that felt true. The guitar he played that day, the battered harmony acoustic that witnessed his mother's last conscious moments, burned in a New York alley in 1963, its ashes swept away with trash and forgotten. But in a way, Jimi never stopped burning it. Every Stratocaster he destroyed on stage was that guitar again, every flame he lit was an attempt to send that sound back through time, to make the offering again, to get it right, to save her in retrospect in a way he couldn't save her in reality. And perhaps that's the real tragedy of Jimi Hendrix, not that he died young, though that was tragic enough, but that he spent his entire adult life trying to recreate a moment of pure love and connection that existed only once, in a hospital room, for a woman who couldn't be saved, and no amount of genius or innovation or revolutionary guitar playing could ever bring him back to that room or let him hear his mother say, "One more time, thank you, baby." The music Jimi Hendrix gave the world was born from that grief, shaped by that loss, driven by that impossible desire to play his way back to a goodbye he never felt was good enough. And every burned guitar, every destroyed instrument, every moment of beautiful violence on stage, was not rebellion or showmanship but ritual, a 15-year-old boy still trying to send his love through flames to a mother he never stopped mourning, never stopped trying to save, never stopped playing for, even after both of them were gone.